While the topic of perpetual war may not be the main focus of George Orwell's novel 1984, it is certainly one of the main elements Orwell uses to immerse the reader in the narrative, and a depiction Orwell believed would then represent the future. In a way, he was not wrong. Before I get ahead of myself, let us first examine how the topic of perpetual war is depicted in the novel. Early on in the book, the party wins a victory on the Malabar front and imposes a chocolate ration, but uses this victory to drown the memory of the lost chocolate. This serves not only to display power over the people and remove their rights, but distract them with a military victory that unites them against Eurasia. Speaking of which, the party also uses this enemy as a way to unite the people with weekly hanging of Eurasian war criminals that are so popular that even children always clamor to be taken to see it. Bringing the war to the citizens and making it personal distracts from the issues the party refuses to address and gives people an event to look forward to motivate them and to justify the war. You may be asking, well, how is this war perpetual exactly? And there is a simple answer. It is because all three major superstates in the book are very much the same and thus would gain no advantage by conquering one another. All of the ways that the people of Oceania are exploited, as previously mentioned, also apply to the two other superstates, and thus the cycle feeds itself and the hungry leaders of the states. That just about covers how perpetual war is depicted in the book. So I would now like to move on to my main topic, the United States' perpetual wars with the countries of the Middle East. This is a complex and tendon-woven tapestry of history involving great suffering and endless fighting. And if you follow the thread to its beginning, you will find its start in the country of Lebanon, 1958. At 3 p.m. on July 15th, 1,700 Marines stormed the beaches of Beirut, backed up by a full 70 warships. These Marines were ready for combat, action, and strong resistance. But the image they found was quite the opposite. Terrain they encountered was hardly a battlefield. Lebanese and foreign sunbathers scrambled for cover. You may be wondering, why, then, was this force dispatched to a seemingly peaceful place? Well, it's due mainly to the U.S.'s fear of Egypt's young new leader, Gamal Abdel Nasser, who pushed for regional Arab unity. Normally, this would not be a pressing issue for the United States. However, his influence on the region led to a coup against the then leader of the Iraq region, King Hussein. Well, this was already an issue for America because King Hussein called on them for support in regaining Baghdad. The Americans also believed that Nasser and his party was backed by a communist Russia, which concerned America due to the current conflict of the Cold War. However, while this conflict was the reason the Marines were deployed, their main objective was different. It was to stop the civil war between the Christian and Muslim communities of Lebanon. They even went as far as to threaten the use of nuclear bombs in a hope to de-escalate the situation. However, in the end, they were victorious, and the president in power, who was the main source of the conflict, stepped down. Now I would like to move on to the next major war in the region the U.S. was involved in, the Tanker War of 1981, a conflict between Iraq and Iran. The Tanker War mostly involved, as the name implies, oil tankers. Iraq used attacks against Iran in the hope that it would provoke them and force them to close the economically valuable Strait of Hormuz. While throughout the war, Iran never closed the strait, they did attack Iraqi ships, which were also used by their pre-established allies, mainly the French and the United States, giving them both stakes in the conflict. After another ally, Kuwait, expressed concerns of attacks being led on their ships, they called for U.S. escorts support, which eventually escalated from an accidental Iraqi attack, which ironically led to the U.S. putting greater pressure on Iran and forcing an end to the Tanker War in 1988. However, relations with Iraq would quickly deteriorate. Not even 2 years later, revitalized from their victory but still in massive debt, Iraq invaded its neighbor Kuwait after conflict arose about Kuwait sabotaging Iraq. The U.S. already had troops posted in Kuwait in the event of an invasion such as this, and the UN began immediately placing sanctions and penalties on Iraq. After Iraq continued to ignore the threats and began dismantling Kuwait's infrastructure, the U.S. appealed to allow military force against Iraq, which was approved by the UN, and led to the subsequent withdrawal of Iraqi troops from Kuwait. This whole conflict irreparably destroyed the alliance between the U.S. and Iraq, but more importantly pitted the U.S. mostly against its leader, Saddam Hussein. For now, I would like to move on to what sparked specifically America's personal conflict with the Middle Eastern countries. On September 11, 2001, a terrorist attack on the U.S. by an organization known as Al-Qaeda, in which 4 commercial airline planes were hijacked. This event, formerly known as 9/11, is something I doubt I have to explain the severity and gravity of. However, the main takeaway for this video is that in retaliation, the U.S. declared war on the nation of Afghanistan in an attempt to flush out the members of Al-Qaeda. The U.S. would largely be successful in this goal, eliminating almost all members of the group. However, the U.S. would maintain constant presence until 2021, where they evacuated sloppily and left the government open for takeover by the Taliban. I say this to show the lengths that the U.S. went to in hopes to prevent another attack on U.S. soil. In the wake of September 11th, the country as a whole was terrified of another attack, and thus took tons of precautionary measures nationally and overseas, where they sought to eliminate any possible threats. And one of these individuals who was deemed as a threat was Saddam Hussein. However, the U.S. had bigger issues on their plate and no direct link between the events of 9/11 and Saddam. That was until President George W. Bush Jr. stated to the American public that he had fears that Iraq possessed weapons of mass destruction, WMDs for short, and had close ties to terrorists that were involved in the attack. Multiple parties of experts were sent to the country to investigate these claims, and via the American government, it was reported that Saddam Hussein possessed WMDs. In the current year, 2024, we know these claims to be false. Iraq did not possess any weapons of mass destruction and was not related to members of Al-Qaeda. However, that was unknown to the American public at the time. The year before the invasion, 83% of people believed Iraq was involved in the events of 9/11. 77 thought Iraq had WMDs, and 75 thought they were harboring terrorists. These falsehoods were not at all helped by the media, who perpetuated this information and caused a mass panic and unknowing deceit of the American people. Similar to the party's censorship of news of battle and distracting the public while maintaining order with violence in the novel. This belief would slowly fizzle out, however, in 2003. 57% of people still believed Saddam Hussein had direct connection to the events of 9/11. Yet, this support would start to drop off rather rapidly over the next decade, with belief that the invasion was the wrong choice reaching an all-time high in January 2007, when President Bush chose to send even more troops to Iraq, stating it was a new way forward. Later, during his 2008 campaign, President Barack Obama vowed to end the war in Iraq, also clarifying that they could not be as sloppy as they were when invading in the first place. This campaign promise mostly stood true, as on December 15, 2011, the U.S. lowered the flag of command they had over Baghdad, much to the huge praise of the American public. Despite this, in 2018, over 53% of people believed that the U.S. had in fact failed in achieving its goals in Iraq, and that is largely due to the misleading goals told to the American public. After it was publicized that Iraq had held no actual connection to Al-Qaeda and possessed no weapons of mass destruction, the American population was outraged and terrified that they had believed in a largely unjust cause. As far as for the future of this conflict and ones like it, things are all pretty muddy. All of the discussed events are barely 2 decades old, and not a ton has changed from a military standpoint with them. The current conflicts in the region the U.S. is involved in are in the countries Yemen, Syria, the Red Sea region, and Somalia. However, this does have somewhat of a silver lining. The Biden administration has been making a push for deoccupation of many of these countries, and while their removal from Afghanistan was sloppy and destructive, the slow phase out of troops from Iraq after the 2014 intervention has been going at a better pace. We are finally reaching a stage where the prospect of evacuating a country and leaving it with a stable government is becoming possible, and I predict this will either cease to happen or become the norm with military occupation. The prospect of another war in the U.S. will engage in the Middle Eastern countries always remains looming. The only real hope now is that the U.S. stays mostly uninvolved, and if they do get involved, serve more as a mitigator of peace than a perpetuator of violence. When it comes to solution, there is a wide range of options. I will briefly touch on these. Obviously, as mentioned above, the U.S.'s evacuation of Iraq in 2021 was much better handled than that in the past, and if this is now a precedent, it would likely reduce repeated conflict that we have seen over the years in the region. Alternatively, there could be a public forum of expression held for conflicting parties to ration why the conflict has begun in the first place, and peace talks could lead to viable compromises. Another good way to stop these mistakes from repeating themselves is to educate the people with the truth on these conflicts. We can already see a trend toward this in some popular media, with stories written across the world such as the series' Pluto and Full Metal Alchemist, which both include commentary on the mistakes made in the invasion of Iraq and the mistreatment of the Iraqi people. In the end, the best we can hope for is not to commit the grave mistakes of those before us, and not succumb to propaganda and lies meant to antagonize foreign bodies. For if we do, we are no better than Orwell assumes.